We'll continue with Part 9, FDA Final Rule, and this will be Subpart D. And before I begin this, I would just like to speak to something. Now, of course, I spoke about it in Part 7, called the Tobacco Control Act of 2009. But I'm going to read it from a section as to where the Health and Human Services Department Secretary actually gets her power in order to regulate the e-cigarette industry. And this comes out of the Tobacco Control Act of 2009. It's Section 901, FDA Authority over Tobacco Products. And it's B. So it's Section 901B of the Tobacco Control Act of 2009. Applicability. This chapter shall apply to all cigarettes, cigarette tobacco, roll your own tobacco, and smokeless tobacco, and to any other tobacco products that the Secretary by regulation deems to be subject to this chapter. It's that one phrase there, that one word, that literally and legally, unfortunately, permits the Secretary of Health and Human Services Department to regulate the e-cigarette industry, where it says by regulation deems to be subject to this chapter. As it says, to any other tobacco products that the Secretary by regulation deems to be subject in this chapter. So that's where she gets her power. It's also under 21 United States Code 387A. So anyway, back to the FDA Final Rule. In 29047, it states, nicotine adversely affects maternal and fetal health. And I just want to say as a side note, and I mentioned this in another part of the project, which I can't remember exactly the video I did it in, but Albert Einstein, he was a pipe smoker, okay? And his grandfather also smoked cigarettes, okay? Now, according to the FDA under the 29047, nicotine adversely affects fetal, meaning the fetal or the fetus that is inside of the woman while she's pregnant, right? Well, apparently, unless Albert Einstein was born on planet Mars to a Martian, Albert Einstein was at one time also a fetus. But Albert Einstein was also a genius. He had like an IQ of like 160. Let me see exactly what his IQ was. This is sort of just a side note, but I just want to prove a point here where the FDA once again is extremely wrong. So Albert Einstein's IQ was between 160 and 190. And he not only did he smoke pipe, he was a pipe tobacco smoker, but his grandfather also, who passed on his own DNA genes to Albert Einstein through the mother or the father, I don't know which side the grandfather falls onto, but nevertheless, their genetics are there. The grandfather passed on these DNA genetics to the mother or father, who passed that on to Albert Einstein. And according to the 29047 of the FDA Final Rule, nicotine adversely affects the fetal or the fetus health. And Albert Einstein's a genius. I think FDA has IQs of probably 100. So in other words, the question really is, does it really affect fetus health or fetal health? Does it really do that? Maybe in some circumstances it does, but the way it reads in the FDA final rule, it makes it appear that maternal or fetal health is affected by nicotine in a negative way. Yet Albert Einstein, who is a genius, is a perfect example that the FDA is absolutely 100% wrong. Now, on to the next part in the FDA final rule. 29046. FDA intends to limit enforcement to finished tobacco products, but to distributors who sell components for further manufacturing. So, let's say a person in a vape shop mixes his or her own e-liquid, and it turns out to be like this. It's the finished product. The FDA probably won't go after that vape shop owner, at least not right away. What they will go after is the distributors who sell components for further manufacturing. So if a distributor sells, I don't know, this cuboid to retailers in the chain of how the point of sale, as far as the chain of, they have the manufacturer, the distributor, retailer, and then the consumer, how that chain works, their business, I don't know a real lot about business, how it really works. I could know if I really studied it, but I never did, so I don't know it. But anyway, but to distributors who sell components for further manufacturing, like for instance, this cuboid is made up of a lighting system in here, or a display. So let's say the distributor sells this display to Joytech to make their cuboid. The FDA can literally go after the distributor, even though the distributor doesn't submit anything into the PMTA or SE application process. Now, how they will do that, they don't really go into at all in the FDA final rule, but it just says that. So those distributors also have to be very careful on how they distribute products, especially after May 10th of 2019, because they can also get themselves in trouble legally. And 29046 states, regulation of the newly deemed tobacco products is intended to address the public health concerns related to these products. And yet, as I read in the very beginning, it says in 28983, FDA is not required to meet a particular public health standard. It just contradicted itself. In 28983, it says that they're not required to meet a public health standard, even though that particular section is in violation of the Tobacco Control Act of 2009. And yet right here it says, regulation of the newly deemed tobacco products is intended to address the public health concerns related to these products. There's contradictions throughout the entire FDA final rule. 29051. FDA intends to supplement this final rule with regulations as appropriate to protect the public health. So over a period of time between draft guidances, which are not actually rules or /statutes, but they're just suggestions to the vaping industry, they'll also supplement or have addendums or amendments to the FDA final rule over a period of time as the FDA deems appropriate to protect the public health. So all that means is more regulations. 29051, if a product is produced in insanitary conditions or is contaminated, or if its labeling contains a misleading claim, it will be subject to enforcement action, including seizure and injunction. So, for instance, it mainly goes to misbranding is really where it's at. And the Tobacco Control Act of 2009 actually speaks to that as well. So let's say, for instance, if they put on this bottle that it is 3 mg bottle, 3 mg of nicotine on the bottle, but when really, after the FDA does its testing of the e-liquid through research labs, testing labs, or whatever have you, and they find the nicotine is not 3 mgs, but it's actually 6 mgs or 10 mgs or 4 mgs or whatever, not only will this e-liquid not be approved by the FDA, but they will also come after whoever manufactured this e-liquid and seize the product and put an injunction in there so you never sell that product again. So that really comes down to misbranding, which is pretty much the same thing as labeling contains a misleading claim. It's very similar, if not really the same thing, I should say. It's the same thing as misbranding. And also it speaks about insanitary conditions or is contaminated. So if a product is produced in an insanitary conditions or is contaminated. And the first thing that came to mind actually when I wrote that down and right now is Dr. Crimmy's e-liquid. Now there was a big stink back in 2015. And I did actually a couple of videos on that particular situation. And after August 8th, 2016, if there are any insanitary conditions or any contaminated conditions within any kind of lab, like Dr. Crimmy's place of business, he said he was just moving. Well, you tell that to the FDA and they're going to shut you down. But something like what happened with Dr. Crimmy's lab, they would literally shut him right down. They would seize all the products, put him out of business, and then put an injunction on there so he never sells any of his e-liquid. In a sense, I certainly can understand that. That, I tend to agree with the FDA, that there should be these safety standards. There should be definitely safety standards in the sense that in sanitary conditions, contaminated products, yeah, that's for safety standards. I certainly can understand that. That's reasonable. That's a reasonable thing to request of the vaping industry. And I'm sure the vaping industry, for the most part, I would probably 99% of it is self-regulated anyway to avoid an insanitary or contaminated situation. 29052, Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act directs FDA to make certain HPHCs, which are harmful and potentially harmful constituents, information publicly available, but it must do so in a way that is understandable and not misleading to laypersons. Well, for Nicopure to file their lawsuit, it took them 3 months for lawyers to get that whole entire complaint together to file the lawsuit, which cost up to millions of dollars to continue on with that case. And yet it's supposed to be understandable and not misleading to laypersons. And that actually comes out of not only like Part 5, the FDA executive orders that I speak to, but that also comes out of the Part 7 Tobacco Control Act of 2009. And it also states that quite clearly in the FDA final rule, that it's supposed to be for laypersons to understand, when that's a bold-faced lie. Anyone that reads, an average Joe or an average Jill that reads the FDA final rule will probably get maybe 25% of it. They will not get the entire meaning of what they're doing with that particular regulation. Absolutely not. That's an absolute bold-faced lie. But they put that in there because it has to be in there because the Tobacco Control Act of 2009 states it has to be in there. So it's really a technicality because, like I said, the layperson does not understand the FDA final rule. 29052, at this time there is little known about the constituents of some newly deemed products. So apparently, they don't, and I've said it throughout the videos in this project, FDA does not have substantial scientific data. So they don't really, like it says, at this time, meaning today, on May 27th, 2016, or on May 10th of 2016, when it was published in the Federal Register, the FDA final rule. At this time, there is little known about the constituents of some newly deemed products, and yet they're regulating the entire e-cigarette industry with little known, with very, very little knowledge of the possible harmful effects of the e-cigarette industry. And in fact, not only do the FDA executive orders I speak to in Part 5, but also the Tobacco Control Act of 2009 in Part 7 actually speaks to that they need to have substantial scientific data before they can pass any kind of regulations through their deeming powers. And apparently, they completely violated both of those areas, the Tobacco Control Act 2009 and the FDA executive orders, let alone in Part 4, the Administrative Procedures Act. So that's it for that. And now I'm going to try to tackle one more page before I end this particular video and then move on to the next. I have about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.5 pages left to go. This has really turned into a very long video series here, but it needs to be done. It really needs to be done for the layperson, because to have all this explained to you by a lawyer, it'll probably cost you $5,000-$10,000 to have this all explained to you, all the issues that I am bringing up, all the sections of the FDA final rule. And though I'm not a lawyer, like I've said before in other videos, in New Jersey I was certified as a paralegal. In Oklahoma I'm not certified, but I know enough about the law to explain it to you and how it all works in the framework of what I've spoke about as far as the Tobacco Control Act, FDA Executive Orders, Administrative Procedures Act, even understanding the FDA contracts, FDA draft guidances, FDA electronic submissions. I understand all that because I understand how to read that type of terminology and the phrasing that they use. It's not only so much the terminology, but it's the phrasing that they use that you have to understand. It's really in the phrasing of the words. That's really the difference between a layperson reading it as opposed to someone who understands law. Not that, like I say, I'm not an attorney. And anything that I do say is not legal advice, by the way. Okay, I've said that before in other video, I think another video. Because you can't give legal advice over the internet. It's actually illegal. Any lawyer that does that could possibly even be disbarred if they do that, he or she does that. So this is not legal advice, but I am explaining it to you as I don't know if I can call myself even a legal expert. Only an expert as far as my experience as a former paralegal, and as well as someone that's did it for years. So I guess in a way I'm expert, but not in the sense of as an attorney. Now an attorney is a entirely different beast of animal. I mean, they're entirely different than a paralegal slash, I should say and or, because paralegals and legal secretaries, they're somewhat similar, but they're really not. So I'll say paralegal and or legal secretary. And a lawyer is much different than both of those categories or classifications. A lawyer is really very well versed in case law. So when they look at the FDA final rule, they're not so much thinking in terms of how I'm looking at it. Though I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do. But what they're really focusing on is the case law, how they can get other cases to relate to the FDA final rule that will favor their case. So they're very, very well versed in case law, which I could read case law. That's cases of, like, in the for instance, like I said in another videos, not in this project I'm doing, but in other videos I've stated, like in the U.S. reports, that's all the cases in the U.S. Supreme Court, or like the Federal Reporter. It could be second edition or third edition, even fourth edition, even fifth edition of different circuit courts. I can understand all the case law. I can read it word for word, understand it, cross-reference it. I understand the phrasing, I understand the terminology. But if I had to recall that before, like if you went to the U.S. Supreme Court and you give oral argument, those lawyers have to recall from the top of their head certain case law that if the U.S. Supreme Court justices request to have the lawyer cite a particular case law to back up his theory or to back up his argument, he has to come up out of the blue with a case law. And see, that's where I differ between myself and being a lawyer, is they're very well versed in case law. You understand? Plus rules as well of the court, the functioning of the court. But it's mainly case law. And the higher up you get, like if you become a judge in maybe a state court or a federal court, U.S. District Court or appellate court or U.S. Supreme Court, then you're even more well versed in case law, because that's all they think about. Like when the U.S. Supreme Court has a memorandum or an opinion of the court, I'd say about 70% of that case, or I would say 70% of the opinion of the court is written strictly in referring to other cases. Yeah. And then you have to do all cross-referencing from that, and that's why it's very, very tedious, especially when you get to the U.S. Supreme Court. And you need to be very well versed as far as your claims before the court and how case law relates to those claims. Because if you're not, you will literally be laughed out of the U.S. Supreme Court with straight faces, because the U.S. Supreme Court justices won't be laughing. They'll just be looking at you like you're wasting our time and maybe you need to go elsewhere. So that's the difference between a paralegal and or a legal secretary and an attorney. They're very well versed in case law. And so, like I said, I understand case law when I read it. But if I had to present case law before a U.S. Supreme Court, which I don't have that, I'm not licensed to do that. But let's say if I could, I wouldn't be able to pull it off because I'm not well versed in case law. And that's really the difference. But outside of that, I still understand how to read the FDA final rule, as opposed to laypersons out there that supposedly, according to the FDA final rule, are supposed to understand everything that I'm explaining to you. But apparently, most, if not all, laypersons out there, not only on YouTube, but in the general public in America, will not understand what they're reading. It's impossible because of the phrasing of the lines. It's not their maybe individual words, but it's the phrasing of the lines that really make the difference between a layperson and someone that understands law. That's the difference. But anyway, this isn't a law class or anything, so I'm not. But anyway, I'll continue on. 29052, it says, FDA has not issued regulations for the currently regulated tobacco products, and did not propose this in the proposed deeming rule. FDA will consider whether it should do so in the future. Ends marketed for smoking cessation, such as a product, would be subject to FDA's drug/device authorities and not subject to FDA's tobacco product authorities. So, as far as the second part of that 29052, the classification of ENDS, which is electronic nicotine delivery systems, is not being treated as a drug or device or medical device by the FDA. And it actually speaks to that in the Tobacco Control Act of 2009. And in the beginning of that line there, that part that I read, the FDA has not issued regulations for the currently regulated tobacco products and did not propose this in the proposed deeming rule. Now it says FDA has not issued regulations, which is a bold-faced lie. The whole point of the proposed deeming rule plus the FDA final rule was to issue regulations. Some of this stuff is so crazy. You know, they really think they can get away with this. This is the reason why it's being adjudicated right now in a court of law, because of the phrasing or because of the way they're putting together the entire framework or structure of the FDA final rule. I mean, they're going to have a field day with it in a court of law. But then it says FDA will consider whether it should do so in the future. Yeah, well, the proposed deeming rule in April of 2014 actually was about regulations. Now, it wasn't essentially issued as a regulation, but it was a proposed regulation. And then the FDA final rule, of course, is definitely an issued regulation. So, I mean, I can sort of understand what they're saying, but they're double speaking here. Because that proposed deeming rule, that the irony of it all is, and I spoke about this in the part 8 FDA draft guidances. The FDA states in the unified agenda, and I also spoke about that earlier in this particular part 9, that because of the unified agenda, let's find this here, unified agenda, it states here. Now, see, this is complete contradiction to the other thing that I just read. In 29012, it says, cannot argue that they did not have adequate notice that they would need to comply with pre-market requirements, given that the unified agenda entry for the deeming proposal published in July 7th of 2011 and was continually updated in subsequent United Agenda entries. So they're saying in that the e-cigarette industry was well aware, way ahead of time, that this FDA final rule was going to come down, and that the proposed rules and the notice or the rules that were a part of that United Agenda, they should have acted upon as if they were regulations, even though they weren't really regulations in statute. They were still treated as regulations that they could be acted upon for the e-cigarette industry to actually start to prepare themselves to be able to submit these PMTA applications when the FDA final rule finally came down, which is in complete contradiction to this 29052. Because they're saying that the FDA has not issued regulations for the currently regulated tobacco products. But yet I just spoke about how they issued regulations back in 2011 all the way up until May 10th or May 5th of 2016, when they put it up on the website, the FDA final rule, and then it was published in the Federal Register on May 10th, 2016, as far as the August 8th, 2016 effective date of the FDA final rule. So it's a very gray area that they're talking about here. And they did issue regulations that the e-cigarette industry could follow and could complete and could meet those requirements, so they would be prepared to submit their PMTA applications now or after August 8th, 2016. In other words, what the FDA was saying there in that particular section, one second, in the 29012, is that they should have completed these applications a year ago because they had plenty of time to do so. They knew the FDA final rule was coming down, so they should have completed these applications and all the substantial scientific data and all this already. You understand? And yet completely contradicts it in the 29052. Crazy stuff, crazy stuff. But the lawyers are going to pick those weaknesses right out of the FDA final rule. You wait for those motions to start going back and forth. And when you have your complaint, the respondent will respond, and then the plaintiff will give a reply. If it's definitely, they usually can give a reply anyway, but usually it's ordered by the judge. And then the motions will just be flying back and forth, compounded with all kinds of briefs and exhibits and you name it. All kinds of documents, insane. Now, you have to understand when the FDA, the federal agency, goes into court. Now, they don't have to be deposed. That is, there's really not a discovery process when they go to court over this because it's an agency action. But the law firms can request all the documentation that the FDA has or the HHS has, and they have to share that information to the other side. But they don't necessarily, by statute, unless the court just through its discretionary powers does this, but I doubt that very much, and that is, like, Nick, a pure lawyer, can't depose Mitch Zeller and sit him down under oath and ask him questions. They can't do that. But they can ask for all the documentation that the FDA has not published, and maybe whatever conclusions they came up with, whatever notes they may have, or whatever it may be, they can get all that information from the FDA through subpoenas from the court or just through the motions. And then the court will actually obligate the FDA to hand over those documents. And if they refuse, then they can make another motion for a subpoena to actually get those documents over to the other side. So anyway, I don't want to get into too much here with the court process. But so, yeah, that whole thing is complete rubbish, what they wrote in there. Anyway, 29054. ENDS retail establishments can allow customers to touch, hold, and smell their products without violating the free sample plan. Can't vape or leave the store with the product. Okay, so let's say you go to a vape shop and they have e-liquid, on the shelf, and you're interested in this e-liquid. Well, according to the FDA final rule, you could touch it. You could touch the bottle. You can hold the bottle, and you can actually smell the bottle. You can smell the bottle. You smell the contents of the bottle without violating the free sample. What you can't do, though, according to the FDA final rule, is you can't vape. After August 8th, 2016, you can't vape what's in this bottle, and nor can you leave the store with this free sample, if it's a free sample like a 10 ml bottle or whatever. You can't, or maybe they do give 30 ml. I've never been in a vape shop, actually. To tell the honest truth, I've never been in a vape shop. I'm more of an online type of guy. I don't hang around in vape shops. But I'm sure that they maybe have 30 ml bottles that are free samples. I don't really know. And if they do, you can't leave the store with the bottle as a free sample. But you can smell it, you can touch it, and you can hold it. You just can't vape it, and you can't leave the store with the e-liquid bottle unless you pay for it. Now, there was actually a comment under one of my videos that said, how about if the e-liquid bottle only cost 1 cent? Could they get around that free sample? Absolutely not. Because it goes to the point of sale. And that is even 1 cent, even a half a cent, if there is such a thing. But 1 cent is still a sale. And it's a transaction, a financial transaction between the consumer and the vape shop owner, employee, or whatever have you. And therefore, that is no longer deemed as a free sample. Understand? Now, it'd be nice if you can get a quote-unquote a free sample for a penny. You understand? But now let's say after May 10th of 2019, after the 36-month time frame there, the staggered times there, but the time frame there, and this e-liquid bottle is not approved by the FDA, and the vape shop owner decides to sell you this bottle for a penny, that vape shop owner is going to be in a serious lot of trouble for selling something that has not been approved by the FDA, even though it was only for 1 penny, let alone as a free sample. So there's no way around that. There's absolutely no way around that. A free sample is a free sample is a free sample. Like I said, you could hold it, you could touch it, and you could smell it. But you can't leave the shop with a free sample. You can't get a free sample no longer on the internet, and you can't vape it. 29055 states, FDA is not banning flavored tobacco products with this final deeming rule. The operative word in that particular line is this, meaning that in this final deeming rule, they're not doing that. Doesn't mean that they won't amend the FDA final rule eventually in the future. So, right now they're not, but they may. But because when it's not a draft guidance, FDA draft guidance. Now, FDA draft guidances don't have to go through the notice of proposed rulemaking process, like public comments and public workshops and all that other stuff. Because the FDA draft guidances are just suggestions to the vaping industry. But if they want to amend the FDA final rule, let's say they decide in 18 months or whatever to ban flavors except for clove, menthol, and tobacco, they have to go through that whole process again of the public workshops, public meetings, and that can go on for months. It has to go on for at least 60 days. It has to go, according to the Tobacco Control Act of 2009, it has to go on for at least 60 days. And most of the time it goes on much longer. But at least 60 days that has to go on. Not that the FDA paid attention to anyone. They didn't pay attention to anyone in 2015. Why do you think they would pay any attention to anyone after with another issue, like banning flavors? But suffice it to say, the good thing about it, the Cole-Bishop Amendment, if the Cole-Bishop Amendment is enacted into law signed by the President, all e-liquid before August 8th, 2016 remain on the market. And the FDA won't be able to ban those particular flavors, those particular e-liquids. And it's not just, let's say there's only 5,000 of these bottles manufactured before August 8th, 2016. Just say that. And then they wind up selling all of the 5,000 bottles. They could still make more of the same bottle without having to go through the PMTA process, because it's the manufacturing date of the bottle that that, in other words, let's say this, I don't know when this bottle was probably made in probably 2014 for I know. I'm going to say 2015 to be nice about it. So let's say this was made in 2015, was manufactured. The manufacturer date of the complete finished product was on, I don't know, June 4th of 2015. Well, this product can remain, this actual product, regardless if it is no longer on the shelf and then they order some more to go onto the shelf. This particular e-liquid that was manufactured on June 5th of 2015 can remain on the market before August 8th, 2016. Now, another e-liquid that is manufactured, let's say on August 10th of 2016, will have to go through the substantial equivalence process because it's considered a new product. Now, on the other hand, now this is going to be a sort of a sticking point here. I'm sure they'll work out the details. But let's say, because they have to label their bottles differently after August 8th, 2016, by labeling the bottle differently creates a new tobacco product according to the FDA final rule. And that probably will be fought in a court of law because even though the manufacturer date is before August 8th, 2016, when you redo your label, it will be done after August 8th, 2016, and that can create a serious problem. So, it doesn't speak to that at all in the FDA final rule, at all. But that could be something that might have to end up in a court of law. Because according to the FDA final rule, they have to change these, unless this label meets all the requirements of the FDA final rule. But like on this particular thing, this print right here is not 12, you have to have a minimum of 12-point font size. And that is definitely not 12-point font size. A 12-point font size is usually when you, like a book. When you read a book, it's one of my favorite books when I used to write. I haven't written a couple of years. I used to be in the theater in New York City. Morton Estlin, the Theater of the Absurd. Anyway, this page here, if you can see that on this camera cell phone, this is 12-point font size. See? I don't know if you can see that. But that is a 12-point font size. And that has to be a minimum of that size on this bottle. And because it changes the bottle, as far as especially the warnings, like nicotine is addictive and things of that nature. Now, not that this has to be like the Cosmic Charlie brand name and all has to be 12-point font size, but the warnings on the bottle has to be a 12-point font size. So in a sense, it changes the label to a degree, which I wonder if probably, maybe not when you think about it. It probably won't change it into a new product, but it could. So, I don't know. We'll see what happens when someone, let's say the Cole-Bishop Amendment is enacted into law, and then they have to change their labeling to a minimum of 12-point font size. It might wind up in a court of law because it literally changes the label into a different product because it looks different. Like right now, this is what it looks like today, but after August 8th, 2016, these warnings here will be in a different font size. So it changes the appearance of this bottle that you usually, when you look at this particular bottle, you know it looks like this all the time. But after August 8th, 2016, it's going to change the appearance of the label. So it might not go into a court of law, or it might go into a court of law. I'm not really sure on that. Anyway, so But like it says in 29055, it says FDA is not banning flavored tobacco products with this final deeming rule. So at this time they're not, but that doesn't mean in the future they won't ban it. They probably will ban it in the future, or at least try to anyway. But the Cole-Bishop Amendment will save most of those e-liquids that were manufactured. The manufacture date was before August 8th, 2016. Then 29057, FDA is finalized. Wait, how's that? Funneling? Okay. FDA is finalizing these requirements without substantial change. Violations of health warning requirements may lead to the insurance of civil money penalties. So, like I was saying on here, they have to put certain warnings on here, like nicotine is addictive. They have to put that on there. And there's a couple other, another warning label they have to put on here after August 8th, 2016. If it is not on here after August 8th, 2016, and the FDA finds out about it, you'll first be given a notice. If you don't comply, then you'll be penalized with a minimum of $15,000, and then it can go up from there. And that's where the civil money penalties go into place. So these warning labels are really about making money for the federal government. Basically, that's what that's all about. Anyway, 29057, a retailer is not required to verify the age of any person who is more than 26 years of age. FDA does not intend to prohibit the sale of tobacco products via the internet. So you could still buy e-cigarettes or vaping products on the internet. Now, most, well, I don't know if it's most, but there are several internet websites that sell vape products that have this identification process to go through, and it's very well encrypted for one thing, but it's very costly, and it's and if they purchase these particular identification processes, then therefore they could sell their products online. So it's not like they're going to ban internet products. They just have to go through a different process of verifying your age, and there's actual and I don't know what they're called, but they're actually, let me see. I don't want this video to go too long, but anyway, 1 second here. Okay, wait, hold it here. Actually, here you go. Look at this. It says, and I was going to read this next. Actually, it was 29059. Retailers may choose any method of identification verification. So when you're in so I don't have to look this up. So when you're in a vape shop, you need to show photo identification unless the owner of the vape shop believes that you are over 26 years old. Now, let's say, for instance, a vape shop owner has a customer, and it's an undercover agent for the FDA, which they will have these agents that come in and do stuff like this. They've done it in the past. They'll certainly do it today and tomorrow. And let's say that individual may look like he's above 26 years old, but really that individual is really only 19 years old, or 18 years old, or 17 years old. And the vape shop owner / employee, and it's mainly even if it goes through the employee, it's the vape shop owner who is liable because he didn't train his employee the correct way. But let's say the employee doesn't ID him because the employee thinks that this person looks like he's 40 years old. And then to find out it's actually an undercover agent for the FDA, and they're penalized in civil monetary damages. And it starts off at $15,000 and goes up for repeated violations. So, and they also can give you a notice. They can give you a notice without penalizing you monetarily. But especially if it's repeated over and over again, like for instance, a perfect example. Let's say that person goes on Monday. That undercover agent goes into the store, the same store on Monday, and he or she is really only, 19 years old. Well, if you're 26 and under, you have to be photo ID'd. And let's say the vape shop owner or employee does not photo ID that person, that would be a notice. But let's say then on Wednesday, another undercover agent goes into that store, does the same thing. That will be automatically a minimum of $15,000 penalty, monetary penalty. And I spoke about that in the part, I believe it was part 6, FDA electronic submissions, as well as part 2, FDA contracts. It's in one or the other of those that I spoke to about as far as the penalties are concerned. But retailers may choose any method of identification verification. So they need to do the photo identification for any people under 26, but there's also other methods that they can use. And that especially means for the internet. And there are, like I said, I don't know what those devices are, that kind of software they put on their computer. That is the vendor. But there is actual software that they can buy that will actually meet the requirements of the FDA final rule as far as verification or age verification. So that is in place. So you can still buy, products that online without a photo ID. You can do that. It's just done much differently after August 8th, 2016. Now, on the other hand, let's say it's an undercover agent for the FDA, and they buy something from a vendor online, and they didn't go through that process that meets the requirements of the FDA final rule in regards to age verification. That vendor online will be given a notice and then will be penalized thereafter, to the point that it can even go to the penalty of $10 million if they take you to court and literally put you out of business. So you got to be really careful what you do. If you're going to try to get around the system, you might wind up bumping into an undercover agent who will put you out of business and or throw you in prison or in jail. You've got to be very careful. If you're going to be doing any of that black market illicit point of sales or selling products online, you've got to be very careful. But there is a method to go through that. So after August 8th, 2016, you'll see it'll change. Those I'm sure all these vendors online are changing their methods of age verification, but it will be different after August 8th, 2016. Unless, if it's the same way, like I go to Giant Vapes once a week to buy e-liquid. Every Friday I order something from them. I just ordered, actually, I didn't order anything today, which is Friday. I actually ordered something on Wednesday. But every week I order a 30 ml bottle of juice from them. Every week. I've done that for over 2 years. That's like, they know me very well. And sometimes, unfortunately, they always give me free samples. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get that after August 8th, 2016. But anyway, I'm sure Giant Vapes has in place already that age verification. And even though even though they've been around for a while, I'm sure, I mean, that's a really good, reputable company. Guide to Vaping 2015 Customer Service Award went to Giant Vapes. So they're really good at that. They're a really good company for customer service especially. But I'm sure because of the reputable company that it is, I'm sure it's going to comply after or on August 8th, 2016 and thereafter. They're definitely going to comply with any age verification software that they must buy if they haven't had it already. I don't know. They just maybe need to install it or whatever, however they do that. I don't know the technicalities when it comes to the software itself. But they do have the software. They just have to apply it as far as the vendors are concerned that do business online. So anyway, I'm going to stop this and then we'll do subpart E. So guys, have a good one until then.